Hi, and welcome to the lecture on attitudes. A person doesn't care for the sound of heavy metal. Another person really likes their social psychology professor. Another person hates getting up before 8 a.m. A student has a particular distaste for the food at the campus student center. In each of these cases, the person has what we call an attitude, which we define as a favorable or unfavorable evaluation of a particular object. The objects of attitudes can be anything, like another person, like Donald Trump or sanitation workers, a place, like DeKalb, Illinois, or your romantic partner's apartment. It could be a thing, like a PlayStation 5 or the novel Little Women, or an idea, like capitalism as an economic system or democracy as a political system. Many social psychologists are interested in studying people's attitudes. In fact, the study of attitudes was the primary object of study in social psychology for a while. Nowadays, social psychologists study lots of other social psychological phenomena other than attitudes. Yet the study of attitudes is still important. Social psychologists argue that attitudes are made up of three specific elements. The first element of an attitude is cognitions. Every attitude that people have consists of specific thoughts and ideas regarding the particular object of the attitude. These thoughts and ideas, whether or not they are objectively true, are people's justifications for holding particular attitudes. For example, I may believe, rightly or wrongly, that Beyonce Knowles is a terrible musical artist because I believe she has a terrible voice and that she doesn't write any of her own songs. These ideas justify my negative attitude toward Beyonce Knowles as a musical artist. And again, doesn't matter if these beliefs are objectively true or not. What matters is that the person believes they are true. Element of an attitude is evaluations. Every attitude that people have about particular objects has an emotional component that varies in direction and intensity. In regards to the direction of the emotional component, people can feel negative, positive, or neutral emotions regarding particular objects. For example, one person might enjoy heavy metal music and thus have positive evaluations of it. Another person might hate heavy metal music and thus have a negative evaluation of it. And another person might feel ho-hum about heavy metal and thus have a neutral evaluation of it. And in regards to the intensity of the emotional component, people can feel strong, neutral, or weak emotions regarding particular objects. For example, one person might really hate heavy metal. Another person might just sort of hate heavy metal. And another person might not feel too strongly one way or another about this genre of music. The third element of an attitude is behavioral dispositions. Attitudes consist of tendencies to act in particular ways towards particular objects. For example, if a person really likes heavy metal, his iPhone is probably going to have several heavy metal albums on it, and he is probably going to attend heavy metal concerts on a regular basis. On the other hand, if a person really hates heavy metal, her iPhone isn't going to have a lot of heavy metal music on it, and she would probably not be found at the next Metallica or Megadeth concert. Social psychologists have also investigated the structure of attitudes, and these social psychologists argue that attitudes have both a vertical structure and a horizontal structure. The vertical structure of attitudes consists of the linkages between fundamental beliefs and minor beliefs that are based upon these fundamental beliefs for a particular attitude. According to social psychologists, many of people's attitudes are based on what they call fundamental beliefs, which are beliefs that serve as the basis for several other beliefs, and often these beliefs go unquestioned. For example, the belief that the Bible is the error-free Word of God is a fundamental belief because this belief is the basis for many other minor beliefs, such as the belief that premarital sex is wrong, that there exists a heaven and a hell and an afterlife, and that divorce is wrong. And it is this belief that is taken for granted and goes unquestioned. The horizontal structure of attitudes, on the other hand, is the linkages between two or more justificatory beliefs for an attitude. This captures the idea that people often have several justifications for a single attitude. For example, a person who has a negative attitude toward premarital sexuality would probably have several beliefs that justify this attitude, such as the belief that God says premarital sex is wrong, the belief that premarital sex can lead to STDs, and the belief that premarital sex can lead to unwanted pregnancies. Social psychologists find that people's attitudes are difficult to change if there are two or more horizontal linkages in the structure of an attitude. This is because even if one of the beliefs that justifies a particular attitude changes, there are other beliefs that still justify the attitude. For example, consider this structure here of the attitude that premarital sex is bad, right? I might be able to change another's belief that God believes that premarital sex is wrong. I could present different interpretations of the Bible that seem to indicate that it's not that wrong. Nevertheless, that person would still likely believe that premarital sex is wrong because the person would have other justificatory beliefs for this attitude, such as premarital sex leads to teenage pregnancy, or premarital sex spreads STDs. This is why attitude change is often hard to do, because you have to sort of battle it on several fronts. Now, social psychologists are very interested in how to adequately measure people's attitudes. This can be quite tricky since attitudes are abstract objects that a person cannot directly see or experience. In general, social psychologists measure attitudes either directly or indirectly. Let's first talk about direct measures, which are measures of attitudes that ask people straightforward what their attitudes are about particular objects. For example, asking how a person feels about her local congressman or about the show The Bachelor would be a direct measure of an attitude. Examples of direct attitude measures include single item and Likert scale questions, asking how people feel about particular objects, which you all learned about during our review of social psychological methods. Indirect measures of attitudes, on the other hand, are measures that use people's behavior toward an object to measure their attitudes about the object. Given that social psychologists believe that there are behavioral tendencies with each attitude, social psychologists use people's actual behavior to get at their actual attitudes. Social psychologists have used several techniques for indirectly measuring people's attitudes. For example, some social psychologists have used the lost letter technique to measure people's attitudes. In one use of this technique, researchers stamped envelopes addressed to various types of political organizations and dropped these letters on the street. The researchers then monitored the proportion from different neighborhoods that are returned to each address. If a high proportion of letters are sent back, then this suggests that persons in the neighborhood hold positive attitudes toward particular types of political organizations, because if they didn't, they would just toss it in the trash. Another example of an indirect technique is the use of audit studies. Audit studies are where researchers send fake resumes or actors out to apply for actual jobs or apartments or what have you, and measure the number of callbacks they get to measure people's attitudes. Social psychologists often use audit studies when people cannot express their actual attitudes for threat of legal action, or when people don't want to admit to others that they hold a particular attitude. For example, in one audit study done in the Milwaukee area, a social psychologist found that a black person without a criminal record was less likely to receive callbacks for jobs than a white person with a criminal record. Another audit study found that employers were less likely to call in homosexuals for an interview than heterosexuals. These audit studies show discriminatory attitudes and hiring practices, which probably could not have been gotten from direct measures because of the threat of litigation. Another common indirect technique used to measure attitudes is to measure what's called response latency, which is the time between the presentation of a stimulus and a behavioral response. For example, some social psychologists measure racial attitudes by measuring how fast people respond to the association of a positive or negative adjective with faces of members of various racial groups. The discussion of implicit measures of attitudes points out a big problem in measuring attitudes, and that is social desirability. Social desirability is the tendency for people to give answers to questions that don't actually reflect their true attitudes, but rather answers that they believe are socially appropriate. For example, in the U.S. today, people don't want others to believe that they are racially intolerant, or at least most people, since being racially tolerant is a norm now. And so people who are actually racially intolerant often don't answer truthfully about their actual racial attitudes if asked directly. Thus, when social psychologists measure attitudes that they believe might elicit a socially desirable response, they often will use indirect attitude measures, since it is harder for people to fake their actual attitudes with these measures. Now, every functioning member of a society has attitudes about many particular objects. But where do these attitudes come from? Well, we have the attitudes that we do for several reasons. First, we have the attitudes that we do because we have had direct personal experience with the objects of these attitudes. There are many types of objects in the world, and most people will only have direct experience with a tiny fraction of these objects. Social psychologists have found that people are more likely to have attitudes about objects in which they have had direct and personal experience than with objects that they have not had direct and personal experience with. For example, some people have taken a sociology course, and these people are more likely to have an attitude about the discipline of sociology than people who have never taken a sociology course. Direct experience with objects explains why people have what's called non-attitudes about many objects. It is hard for a person to have an attitude about something that she has never heard of or experienced. This is an important point because sometimes social scientists just assume that people have attitudes about objects when in fact they do not. Another reason that we have the attitudes that we do is socialization. Social psychologists find that people are often socialized by others to hold particular attitudes. In particular, Children often share many specific attitudes with their adult caregivers. Thus, there is some truth to the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The socialization of attitudes occurs through the socialization processes of modeling and instrumental conditioning that we've talked about before. Social psychologists argue, for example, that children often model the attitudes of their adult caregivers. Consider the scenario, for example, where a young child sees his parents show signs of emotional discomfort when they encounter members of different racial groups. Initially, the child has little or no emotional reaction to the characteristics of these people. However, after seeing how their parents negatively react to people of different racial groups, these children are likely to form negative attitudes towards people who belong to these racial groups. Social psychologists also argue that instrumental conditioning leads to the formation of attitudes. For example, if a person has parents who reward her consistently for expressing or acting like she has a positive attitude toward academics, this person is very likely to develop and internalize a positive attitude towards academics. We have the attitudes that we do is because of natural selection. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that humans are prone to have certain attitudes because these attitudes helped early humans survive. Having certain types of attitudes helped early humans solve recurring problems. Some of these attitudes, such as conservative attitudes that allow resources only to be shared amongst kin, the positive attitude toward religious beliefs, and positive attitudes towards marriage, children, and friends, allowed early humans to adapt, survive, and pass on their genes to the next generation. Those that did not have these attitudes in this ancestral environment would not have survived to pass on their genes to the next generation. For example, early humans that did not have positive attitudes toward children probably didn't have any children, and thus they did not pass on their genes to the next generation. And another reason that we have the attitudes that we have is intelligence. Some evolutionary social psychologists argue that having high intelligence allows some people to override, so to speak, the attitudes that natural selection has made humans prone to have. For example, certain attitudes, such as political liberalism and atheism, are what evolutionary social psychologists call evolutionarily novel. That is, early humans tended not to have such attitudes. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that what we call general intelligence, or IQ, evolved to help humans deal with novel problems. Because intelligence evolved to meet novel problems, more intelligent people would be more likely to have evolutionarily novel attitudes such as liberalism and atheism. And evolutionary social psychologists have provided evidence for this argument. As you can see from this chart, as IQ rises, so do people's preferences for liberal political ideology, which is, according to their argument, evolutionarily novel. We are prone to be conservative. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that the more intelligent a person is, the more likely she can override, so to speak, the tendency to have certain attitudes like political conservatism and hold other attitudes such as political liberalism. Two other reasons we have the attitudes that we have is because of our apparent need for attitudes to be consistent with one another and from being persuaded by others to hold particular attitudes. We'll have whole lectures on these reasons in the future, so Stay tuned. Social psychologists also argue that attitudes serve three main functions for people. This answers the question of why people have attitudes in the first place. First, attitudes serve as heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts and rules of thumb people use to make decisions quickly or to help them make decisions when they're not sure what to do. Attitudes are heuristics because people develop favorable attitudes towards objects that reward them and unfavorable attitudes towards objects that punish them. And thus they use these attitudes to make snap judgments about how to act. For example, business people seem to develop a positive attitude toward the Republican Party in the U.S. because the Republican Party is known for being very pro-business. Thus, instead of wasting a lot of time thinking about who one is going to vote for, business people can use their attitudes as a heuristic to make a quick decision, such as voting for any Republican candidate that they see on a ballot, even if they've never even heard of the candidate. Second, attitudes express personal identities. Many attitudes express people's cherished values, and these values are an integral part of their personal identities. For example, a person who believes she is hardworking is probably going to have a positive attitude toward hard work. Third, attitudes express social identities and group memberships. Groups often have attitudes about objects that are shared among members. For example, members of the National Rifle Association share a common positive attitude toward firearms, and members of the National Organization of Women hold positive attitudes concerning women's rights. Now, although social psychologists have a number of reasons for measuring attitudes, probably the biggest reason they care about measuring attitudes is because they want to use these measures to predict people's actual behaviors. Early social psychologists believed that people's expressed attitudes towards objects strongly predicted how people would behave toward these objects. They thought that if a person expressed a particular attitude, he would invariably act in ways that conform to this attitude. In other words, early social psychologists believed in an invariable and direct attitude-behavior link. For example, if a person said that he would discriminate against Asians, then he would always discriminate against Asians. This view was challenged by other social psychologists. Many social psychologists found that people's expressed attitudes often didn't match up with their actual behavior. For example, in your reading for this lecture, a social psychologist asked hotel managers in the western U.S. if they would allow Asians to stay in their hotels. It was the 1930s when he did this study, and discrimination against Asians was rampant at the time, especially in this part of the country. He found that many of the hotel managers said that they would not let any Asians stay at their hotels. However, when he actually went to these hotels with some of his Asian friends, he found that very few of the hotel managers wouldn't allow Asians to stay in their hotels. They were allowed to stay for the most part. So there was not a direct behavior attitude link. The hotel managers said no Asians allowed, yet when Asians came, they were allowed right in. So what's up? Well, because of the flawed nature of the early attitude behavior link assumption, social psychologists have tried to identify the factors that determine when attitudes actually do lead to behavior. One factor that influences the attitude-behavior link is the cognitive accessibility of attitudes. In general, the more accessible the attitudes are in people's minds, or the more the attitude is at the top of one's head, so to speak, the more likely the attitude will influence people's behavior. For example, in one survey, people were asked, who they were going to vote for in an upcoming election. The researchers measured people's cognitive accessibility of their attitude by how long it took them to answer the question. If they answered quickly, then the attitude had high accessibility, right? They didn't have to think about it too much. They just answered. If people took a while to answer, they had to think about it. Their attitude had low accessibility. The researchers then called back the participants after the election. They found that the more accessible the attitude at time one, the more likely that the people were to actually vote for the candidate that they said they were. Another factor that influences the attitude behavior link is the strength of the evaluative elements of attitudes. Social psychologists have found that attitudes are better predictors of behavior when people strongly hold these attitudes than when they just weakly hold these attitudes. This is because the emotions that make up the evaluative element of attitudes motivate people to act in particular ways. And the stronger the emotion, the more compelling the motivation. For instance, say that you know two people who have a negative attitude toward the death penalty. One is very much against the death penalty and feels strongly that it should be abolished, while another person doesn't have as strong feelings about the death penalty. In this case, the first person's attitudes toward the death penalty is a much more likely predictor of behavior than the other person's attitude. This is why social psychologists often prefer to measure attitudes using a Likert scale, because this allows them to capture the intensity of the evaluative elements of people's attitudes. We are more certain that people who very much disagree with the death penalty are more likely to act on this attitude than people who somewhat disagree with the death penalty. Another factor that influences the attitude behavior link is direct experience with the objects of attitudes. In general, social psychologists have found that attitudes based on personal experiences with the objects of these attitudes are more likely to predict behavior than attitudes not based on personal experience. This is because direct experience with objects of attitudes gives people actual information about the objects, and this information influences future behavior regarding these objects. For example, if a person had direct experience with the death penalty, for example, they had a friend murdered and the person who did it got the death penalty, or they have a friend or family member on death row, then their attitude toward the death penalty will better predict how they will behave toward the death penalty than people who don't have direct experience with the death penalty. Another factor that influences the attitude behavior link is the certainty of attitudes. In general, social psychologists have found that the more certain people are of their attitudes, how firm they are in their attitudes, how much they believe that their attitudes are right, so to speak, the more likely these attitudes will predict behavior. For example, social psychologists did a survey where they asked people who they were going to vote for during the next presidential election and how certain they were going to vote that way. The researchers then called the participants back 15 days after the presidential election and asked who they voted for. As you can see from this graph, the researchers found that people who were highly certain of who they were going to vote for were much more likely to vote for the candidate they said they were going to vote for than people who were less certain. Another factor that influences the attitude behavior link is the specificity of attitudes. In general, social psychologists have found that attitudes towards objects in general and in the abstract aren't very good at predicting behavior. However, attitudes towards specific objects are much better predictors of behavior. For example, one study measured women's attitudes towards the use of birth control. They asked very general questions about birth control, such as, are you in favor of birth control? As well as very specific questions about birth control, such as their attitude toward birth control pills, and specifically their attitude toward actually using birth control pills, and whether they would use birth control pills in the next 2 years. The researchers then interviewed the women later on and asked them about their actual use of birth control pills. And as you can see from this graph, the more specific the attitude, the more likely it was to actually predict people's future behavior. Birth control in general, not very good predictor of behavior. Attitude toward birth control pills, you're getting stronger. Attitude toward actually using birth control pills, even stronger, right? The moral of this study is that if researchers want to actually predict behavior with measures of attitudes, they must be very specific about the questions that they use to measure these attitudes. Another factor that influences the attitude-behavior link is normative constraints, which are norms that constrain or compel people from performing particular behaviors. For example, a person might have a positive attitude towards smoking marijuana, but she may not actually do so because this behavior would violate normative standards. Conversely, a person may have a negative attitude toward academics, but he still attends school every day because that's what he is supposed to do, according to his parents, his teachers, and other authorities. Another factor that influences the attitude-behavior link is people's beliefs about self-efficacy, which is defined as people's beliefs about their abilities to perform certain behaviors. People may want to act on an attitude, but don't believe that they have the ability to do so. For example, a person may have a positive attitude towards smoking marijuana, but they may not know how to obtain it. They may not know a dealer. No matter what the attitude, if people don't think they can act on it, then the attitude will be a poor predictor of behavior. Many of the findings regarding the attitude-behavior link are summarized in the theory of planned behavior. The theory of planned behavior argues that three factors need to be considered when predicting when attitudes will influence behavior. 1, the actual attitudes toward the behavior. 2, normative constraints. And 3, self-efficacy. According to the theory of planned behavior, the combination of attitudes, normative constraints, and self-efficacy leads to behavioral intentions, which is how much energy and effort people are willing to exert to perform a particular behavior. And these behavioral intentions then lead to actual behavior. The three factors can lead to a variety of combinations and thus lead to different behavioral predictions. For example, say that a guy has a positive attitude about another gal. If he doesn't feel that he can actually get up the nerve to ask the gal out on a date, i.e. he has little self-efficacy, then his behavioral intention will be low, and thus his positive attitude toward the gal will not likely influence his actual behavior. Another example. Let's say that a guy has a positive attitude toward smoking pot and knows how to do it and knows where to get it. However, let's say many of his friends and family members have a negative attitude toward smoking pot and will look down upon him if they found out he smoked pot. In this case, normative constraint would be high, and this would lessen the chance that this person's positive attitude towards smoking pot would lead him to actually smoking pot. Also, there are many cases in which people have the means to perform a behavior and no normative constraints for performing the behavior. However, this doesn't mean that they'll do the behavior because they might have a negative attitude toward the behavior. For example, I'm not the biggest baseball fan in the world, and so you're probably not going to see me at many White Sox or Cubs games in the near future, even though I have the means to do so, and none of my family members or friends would be angry at me for going to a baseball game. Okay, so that is the lecture on attitudes. The next lecture will be about attitudinal consistency. Bye-bye.